Welcome to this episode of ACG's Growth TV. I'm Katie Mulligan, editor-in-chief of ACG's magazine, Middle Market Growth. This episode is part of our series for executives at private equity-backed companies, sponsored by RSM US, a leading accounting, tax, and advisory firm dedicated to the middle market. Today, we'll be looking at how to make cybersecurity part of your company's DNA, plus how to decide what's enough security and what that looks like. My guests are two cyber experts from RSM, Anthony Catalano, Director and National Cyber Lead for Private Equity, and Oliver Snavely, Director and Private Equity Lead for Risk Consulting. Anthony and Oliver, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Katie.
Awesome to be here, Katie.
Oliver, where should a private equity firm begin when trying to determine how much cybersecurity protection it needs?
Yeah, Katie, that's a great question. So traditionally, we'll look at the cybersecurity needs of a portfolio investment at the due diligence phase as the private equity firm is looking to sort of really get into the nuts and bolts around what sort of cyber governance strategy that the portfolio company will be having currently as they look towards the future. And really standing up the idea around what that sort of structure should look like from a governance standpoint going forward, and really looking at the first 100 days and the first year plan to prioritize what sort of new and sort of implementing different sort of strategies around risk mitigation as it relates to cybersecurity and data privacy based on whatever risk appetite they have as it relates to, one, being the industry that they're getting into with that potential investment, and two, the overall risk appetite at the at the private equity fund. Anthony, I think you might have some insights more specifically as it relates to, really digging in and what that might look like in the first 100 days in the first year.
Yeah, absolutely, Oliver. So I think, as Oliver kind of alluded to, all private equity funds and all portcos really need a minimum viable security product. They need minimum parts of their security program to be implemented and running well in order to reduce their risk overall. So those things are security awareness training, vulnerability scanning, policy and procedure development, and a basic cybersecurity governance structure. And I think once you get past those things, the next step for a private equity, either a fund or a portco to consider is what are the acceptable risks that the organization is willing to take? So can the organization accept a downtime scenario of 1 day? Can they accept a downtime requirement of several days? Those are things that need to be considered prior to moving the cybersecurity program forward. And once you understand what that is, what those risks are and which ones are acceptable to the organization, then you can start to build the cybersecurity program around that. Another question we challenge in the private equity space is, where is my next best security dollar spent? Until you do the first two parts of that, you're going to have a challenge spending your next best dollar in the security program. So that's something that the organization needs to ask itself before it can move forward.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned just now determining what the acceptable risks are. I'm interested, Anthony, to know whether, when you're trying to gauge the risk appetite of a firm, do these private equity firms tend to understand what the cyber risks are in the first place?
I think from a cyber perspective, you always think, we want to avoid a bad event, right? But what could that bad event look like? And I think, in recent years, you've seen a huge uptick in cyber incidents, and specifically around ransomware. And I think something to consider with ransomware is that if an organization gets ransomware and they pay the ransom, it's going to take several weeks before they can actually recover and be functional again. Mm-hmm. If the organization says, hey, we're not going to pay the ransom, we don't negotiate with terrorists, and we're going to restore from backups, that process also takes a couple weeks. So you're looking at an extended downtime scenario in either event. What organizations need to do in this type of environment is really understand, do we care about protecting our assets? Do we care about a downtime scenario? If we don't care about that, then let's go ahead and move on and spend our money elsewhere. But if we do care, what steps do we need to take next in order to mitigate those risks so we don't realize one of those downtime scenarios or loss of business or loss of customer data?
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine the conversations are a bit different depending on whether you're working with someone at the private equity fund level versus at a portfolio company. Oliver, how do the needs differ across those two dimensions?
Well, I think when we look at the different levels there from a portfolio firm fund level perspective, it's really on the monitoring, right? And understanding where are my risks at across my portfolio and which organizations within that portfolio are most susceptible, from an industry or from just a governance perspective, given the maturity of their cyber program. And I think when we look at operating partners and potentially deal partners as they're going through and analyzing their risks, they're thinking about it from more so of, okay, what's the risk to my investment? What's the risk to my thesis? And how do I make sure that the folks that are actually operating within the portfolio company are managing those risks and are actually adhering to the plan that we've set in place? And so I think that's really the monitoring function at the portfolio fund level. Whereas at the portfolio company level, we're looking at it, they're looking at it much more from the operational standpoint and executing on the plan that's been put in place. And I think that's where you're going to see a lot more interaction with experts in the cybersecurity field and really looking to get that minimum viable security program in place such that you're not, constantly worried about the events that Anthony mentioned happening. You can start to look forward and start to really monitor your program at your company so that then when you step up to the private equity fund level, the fund can understand, okay, what's my exposure at each of my portfolio companies, because now I have a minimum viable program at each, and it's easier to monitor as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. And Anthony, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, actually, a perfect example of this, there's actually a fund that retained us to be the virtual CISO for all of their portcos. And what we did is we actually created a standardized risk assessment process for each of those portcos. And we went and we analyzed all of those portcos' cyber performance. With that, we obviously identified challenges and issues within the cyber program. So as Oliver articulated, what we're doing is we're working at the portco level with their management teams to make sure that they're implementing the controls in order to reduce their cyber risk. On the flip side of that, we're actually creating key performance indicators and key risk indicators. So at the fund level, they know that the organizations are remediating those risks and actually either improving or not improving. But overall, they're getting a very clear picture of the performance of those portcos at the fund level. Mm-hmm. So we're kind of working with two different teams in that particular example. And it's important to actually maintain relationships at both levels to make sure the programs progress.
Hmm. And Anthony, where does cyber liability insurance factor into all of this? And how are changes affecting how company leaders should think about their cybersecurity practices?
It's such a great time to be talking about this. It's really interesting. We've been engaged with a lot of cyber liability insurance carriers in the last month, 2 months. And really, insurance providers are really starting to get very concerned about the amount and the number of payouts that they're making. So, we see that the number of ransomware payouts are going up. That's obviously going to cost the insurers money. So cyber insurance claims and costs are actually rising dramatically. And the providers are challenged here. If you think about it, cybersecurity insurance is really a transfer of risk. So you're saying, I'm going to take this risk and move it over to a third party, and they're going to accept it for us. And they need to think about how they actually lower that risk that they're transferring to the cyber liability insurance companies. So if you're not following those cyber best practices, you're actually exposing yourself. And something else to think about when you're filling out your application for cyber liability insurance, if there's any errors in that application where you misrepresent something, you're creating a potential exposure for the organization where you might not get a payout in the event of a breach. So it's actually an absolutely critical part of companies' DNA. And Oliver, I know you had some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so I think as we really get to the cost of doing business concept as it relates to insurance, it's important from an optimization perspective to really think about how can we implement the most effective and efficient cybersecurity programs such that, one, we're minimizing our cost of potential events that could occur. Two, we're reducing our cost of insurance because we have a solid program in place. And three, really just looking at the risk management value creation lever that we have as we think about the portfolio company and the private equity fund's investment, and really looking to generate return off of those risk management activities.
All right, well, we will leave it there for today. Anthony and Oliver, thank you so much for joining me on Growth TV.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.